When Donald Trump first raised those tariffs on Indian goods, he may have thought he was sending a clear signal that America would always hold the upper hand. He may have believed that India, like so many others before, would bow its head in silence, take the punishment quietly, and continue as if nothing had changed. But what he did not understand was that this is not the India of the past. This is not the India that once waited for approval, that once asked for a seat at the table. This is a new India, confident, strong, rooted in its pride, and unshaken in its dignity. So when the tariffs came, New Delhi's decision to suspend postal services was not simply about stopping letters and parcels. It was about declaring to the world that India refuses to be bullied. It was about sending a message that said, "We will not allow you to treat us as lesser. We will not let you drag us into submission. If you believe you can strike us without consequence, you are mistaken." That act was not just about policy. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and the unapologetic refusal to bow down. And let me tell you, my friends, dignity, once awakened, cannot be silenced again. And yes, at first glance, some might look at postal services and ask themselves, what does that even mean? How does that make a difference? But the truth is, power is not always in the grand gestures. Sometimes power is hidden in the small, symbolic acts that carry deeper meaning. Think about it. The postal system has always been more than letters and packages. It is the thread that connects people across oceans, the bridge between families separated by continents, the messenger of trade and friendship, of cultural exchange and partnership. When India suspended that service, it wasn't just shutting down the mail. It was shutting down a bridge. It was saying, this bridge of trust you have broken, and until you respect it again, we will not allow you to cross. And that symbolism reverberates louder than numbers and statistics. It told America, and it told the world, that relationships cannot be one-sided, that trust once broken cannot be repaired without accountability. That, my friends, is the kind of quiet but unshakable power that India exercised in that moment. For so long, Donald Trump has played the role of the disruptor, wielding tariffs like hammers, knocking down any nation that dared to challenge him. He has thrown threats around as if they cost him nothing, believing that others had no choice but to accept them. He thought he was the one holding all the cards. But in this moment, when India responded by suspending something so ordinary, yet so essential, he got a taste of his own medicine. For the first time, he stood on the receiving end of disruption, feeling the sting of consequences he had so often inflicted on others. The mirror was turned toward him, and in it, he saw a reflection of his own tactics. And let me tell you something, sometimes the most painful lesson is not when you hurt others, but when you finally feel what it is like to be hurt in the same way. That is what happened here. Trump, who built his reputation on breaking, found himself broken by a move he did not expect. And in that lesson, the world saw justice take shape. But the brilliance of India's response lay not just in the act itself, but in the manner in which it was carried out. Because unlike America's loud declarations, unlike Trump's aggressive speeches, unlike the chest-thumping bravado that often fills his words, India responded with silence. There was no shouting, no drama, no chaos. Just a calm suspension that said more than any speech ever could. That is true power. That is quiet strength. Because when you do not need to raise your voice, when you do not need to scream to be heard, that is when people truly listen. India chose restraint over rage, composure over chaos, calm over conflict, and in doing so, it showed the world a new kind of leadership. Leadership that does not depend on noise but on principle, that does not depend on intimidation but on dignity. That is how India's quiet power spoke louder than threats, and that is why the world stood still and paid attention. And let us be clear, this moment was not only about Washington, it was about the entire world watching closely. For decades, India has been seen as a rising power, always promising, always on the edge of greatness. But with this act, India demonstrated that it has arrived, no longer the follower, no longer the nation waiting on others, no longer the country content to be in the background. India showed the global community that it has grown into its own skin, into its own authority, into its rightful place among the leaders of nations. And when a country like India, with its history, its population, its economy, and its vision stands up and says, we will not accept disrespect. It is not just America that listens. It is the entire world. Nations from Africa to Asia, from Europe to South America, all saw this as a moment of reckoning. They saw that the balance of power is shifting, that India is no longer small, no longer silent, no longer willing to be overlooked. And when one country dares to do this, others feel the courage to rise too. That is why this suspension of postal services, as small as it may seem, marks the dawn of a new balance in world politics. For too long, America has dictated the rules, setting terms that others were forced to follow. But that era is ending. We are entering a time where nations like India step forward, not just as participants, but as leaders. A time where respect cannot be demanded, but must be given in return. And this small act, this refusal to continue business as usual, is the seed of a larger movement. It is a reminder that power must be shared, that partnerships must be equal, and that arrogance has no place in diplomacy. The old order is cracking, and a new one is being born. And at the heart of this new order stands India, unshaken, unapologetic, and ready. So, my friends, as we witness this turning point, let us understand its weight. This is not about parcels. This is not about letters. This is about dignity. This is about respect. This is about telling the world that India bows to no one, that India knows its worth, that India, when pushed, will push back, and not with rage, not with destruction, but with quiet power that echoes across continents. The suspension of postal services may be temporary, but the message it carries is eternal. India has arrived, and the world must never forget it. Now, some people may look at this decision, India suspending postal services to the United States, and shrug. They may say, what is the big deal? It's just letters, just parcels, just mail. How does that matter in a world dominated by trade weapons and technology? But my friends, let me tell you something I've learned about life, about history, and about the ways of power. Sometimes the smallest gesture carries the deepest meaning. Sometimes what looks insignificant on the surface becomes the very thing that reshapes how nations see each other. Think about it. The Postal Service is one of the oldest forms of connection between human beings. Long before we had airplanes, before we had email, before we had instant messages on glowing screens, there was the letter, there was the parcel, there was the handwritten word traveling across mountains, across oceans, across continents to remind someone far away that they were not forgotten. That service became the thread that stitched together families torn apart by distance, businesses separated by geography, and governments bound together by agreements. So when India suspended that service to the United States, it wasn't simply shutting down a logistical route. It was breaking a thread. It was saying, this bond we once shared, we are no longer willing to carry it on our shoulders while you show us disrespect. That is why this act was symbolic and why it was powerful. Because symbolism is often the sharpest weapon in politics. It does not scream, it whispers, and yet its whisper echoes in the hearts and minds of millions. By halting the flow of something as ordinary, as human as the mail, India reminded the world that respect is not built on grand speeches. It is built on trust. And trust, once broken, poisons even the simplest of exchanges. It doesn't matter if it is $1 billion trade deal or a birthday card sent overseas. If there is no respect, the connection has no meaning. And let us be honest, America, under Donald Trump's leadership, believed it could impose tariffs, strike India's economy, and still expect the flow of everyday connections to continue without interruption. They believed India would keep carrying on as though nothing had happened. But New Delhi said no. India decided to send a message that reached deeper than numbers, deeper than policies, deeper than the language of economics. It was a message about dignity. It was about looking the most powerful nation in the world in the eye and saying, you cannot treat us unfairly and still expect us to carry your mail. You cannot wound us with tariffs and still expect our cooperation as though nothing has changed. You cannot demand partnership while practicing disrespect. And here's the truth we often forget. Power is not always in the loudest strike. Sometimes true power lies in the subtle, in the unexpected, in the small disruption that makes the mighty pause. That is what India achieved with this suspension. Because America could dismiss an argument, it could dismiss an angry speech, it could even dismiss tariffs in return, but it could not dismiss the symbolism of being cut off from something as ordinary, as essential as the postal link between two great nations. It forced Washington to stop and ask itself, is this what our relationship has come to? Let me tell you why this matters. In diplomacy, gestures often carry more weight than words. A handshake between leaders can heal years of hostility. A walkout in the middle of negotiations can fracture alliances. A flag lowered or raised can shift the mood of entire nations. In the same way, a suspension of mail services carries a symbolic heaviness far beyond the surface. It says, we will not play along while you disrespect us. We will disrupt not with war, not with threats, but with silence, with withdrawal, with absence. And absence, my friends, can often be louder than presence. So when critics dismiss this move as minor, they fail to understand the language of dignity. They fail to see that by targeting something so simple, India made its message clearer than ever. We will not let you forget what you did. We will not let you carry on as if everything is fine, because sometimes in order to make the world stop and notice, you don't have to raise your fist. You just have to fold your arms and refuse to move. This was India's way of saying that relationships cannot be transactional forever. You cannot slap tariffs in one hand and expect friendship in the other. You cannot demand loyalty and trust while giving none in return. Every relationship between individuals, between communities, and yes, between nations depends on mutual respect. Without that, there is no foundation. And that is the lesson India wanted to carve into this moment. And maybe, just maybe, the world needed this reminder. Maybe America needed to see that a so-called small act can sting more than 1,000 words. Maybe it needed to understand that dignity cannot be measured in dollars, cannot be counted in trade balances, cannot be silenced by power, because dignity is lived, dignity is shown. Dignity is the refusal to continue the bond when that bond is built on inequality. That is what India did. It chose symbolism over rage, restraint over retaliation, calm over chaos. And in that quiet decision, the world heard something louder than Trump's tariffs, louder than his threats, louder than his speeches. They heard the sound of India's dignity, unbreakable, unapologetic, undeniable. For years, Donald Trump has strutted across the global stage with one weapon in his hand, tariffs. He wielded them like a hammer, slamming down on country after country, believing that every blow would bend them into submission. He imposed tariffs on China, on Europe, on Mexico, and yes, on India too, convinced that this tool of intimidation would make others fall in line. And in the short term, perhaps it looked powerful. Perhaps it looked like America was unshakable, unstoppable, dictating rules while everyone else scrambled to adjust. But here is what Trump forgot: every action creates a ripple. Every blow you strike leaves a bruise. And sometimes the very tactic you use to humiliate others returns to humble you. That is exactly what happened when India suspended postal services. This was Trump, for the first time, tasting his own medicine. For so long, he dished it out freely with little concern for the lives, the businesses, the relationships it disrupted. He laughed at the discomfort of others, celebrated the fear he spread, and wore his disruption like a badge of honor. But suddenly, the tables turned. Suddenly, it was America on the receiving end of a disruption it did not expect. Suddenly, Trump found himself facing the sting of consequences that looked very much like the ones he had been handing out all along. And my friends, life has a way of teaching lessons like this, because the universe always returns what you give. And in this case, Trump was served a dose of the very chaos he thought he could control. Now, let us understand something important here. India's suspension of postal services may not have rattled Wall Street in the same way tariffs rattled economies, but the message it carried was far more personal. Tariffs are about money, about trade flows, about cold calculations. But the mail is about people. It is about families sending letters to loved ones, businesses exchanging contracts, students receiving documents, workers sending parcels home. It is about connection. And when India cut that line, it was not just an economic inconvenience, it was an emotional jolt. It reminded America that disrespect has consequences beyond the boardroom. It reaches into homes, into relationships, into the lives of ordinary people. And in that way, the medicine was bitter, sharper than Trump imagined. And isn't it ironic? Here was a man who built his identity on disruption, who believed that the more chaos he created, the stronger he looked. He thought he could bend nations to his will by making their lives more difficult. But when India mirrored his tactic back at him, he discovered something new. Disruption feels very different when it is turned on you. It is no longer a show of strength. It is a reminder of vulnerability. It is no longer a performance of power. It is a taste of humility. And that, my friends, is why this move stung Trump so deeply. Because it was not just about the loss of a service, it was about the loss of control. And here's the truth: the most powerful nations often believe they are untouchable. They think they can impose, demand, dictate, and the rest of the world will adjust. But what India showed is that even the most ordinary decision, halting the mail, can send a shockwave strong enough to make the mighty pause. It told America, you are not above consequences. You are not beyond reach. You cannot expect loyalty when you hand out only punishment. And in that simple, symbolic act, Trump learned the very lesson he had tried to force onto others. No one is too big to be checked. No one is too powerful to be challenged. But let us also see this for what it truly is. This was not about revenge. This was not about India trying to humiliate Trump in the same way he humiliated others. This was about balance. It was about teaching respect. It was about saying, if you play this game, you must be prepared to experience its consequences too. Because fairness demands reciprocity. And reciprocity is what Trump had always avoided. He expected the world to absorb his blows without ever striking back. But this time, India did. And the message was clear: you cannot live by one standard and expect others to live by another. And so, history will remember this as the moment when Trump finally tasted the bitterness of his own tactics. The man who dished out tariffs, who celebrated disruption, who thrived on intimidation, finally found himself on the receiving end of disruption that was quiet but piercing. And though he may never admit it, though he may never speak of it openly, the sting was felt. And in that sting lay a lesson, not just for him, but for every nation watching. The medicine you hand out today may be the medicine you swallow tomorrow. So let us reflect on what this means for India. It means that New Delhi is not just reacting, it is teaching. It is holding up a mirror to America and saying, see yourself as we see you. Feel what you have made us feel. Experience, if only for a moment, the disruption you have normalized. That mirror is powerful. That mirror is transformative. Because once you are forced to see your reflection, you cannot forget it. And Donald Trump, whether he acknowledges it or not, has now seen his reflection through India's eyes. That is the beauty of this moment. That is the justice in this story. Because the truth, my friends, is eternal. What you give out, you will always get back. And in that way, India's decision was not just about postal services, not just about tariffs. It was about teaching a timeless lesson that arrogance has consequences, that disrespect will always be returned, and that the medicine of intimidation, when forced upon others, will one day be tasted by the very hand that delivered it. What struck the world most about India's suspension of postal services to the United States was not the act itself, but the way it was carried out. Because unlike America's approach under Donald Trump, loud, dramatic, filled with threats and thunder, India chose silence. There was no shouting, no chest beating, no grand display of aggression, just a quiet, firm decision that spoke volumes without raising its voice. And my friends, let me tell you, sometimes the most powerful response is not the roar, but the whisper. Not the storm, but the calm. We have seen how America under Trump thrived on noise. Every tariff was announced with fanfare, every speech punctuated with threats, every action designed to intimidate. It was a politics of spectacle where power was equated with volume and where the louder you spoke, the stronger you appeared. But India chose a different path. It did not mirror that noise. It did not rise to that drama. Instead, it chose restraint. And in that restraint was a strength that shook the world far more than any angry speech could have. Think about the message this sent. America expects confrontation. It thrives on it. It knows how to fight a loud battle, tariffs against tariffs, threats against threats. But what it does not know how to respond to is silence. Silence unsettles. Silence confuses. Silence forces you to pause, to reflect, to realize that the game you're playing is not being played on your terms anymore. And that is what India did. It changed the rules of the game without ever needing to say a word. This is the essence of quiet power. It is not about being passive. It is not about being weak. Quiet power is deliberate. It is intentional. It is knowing that you don't need to shout to be heard. It is knowing that dignity does not require noise. It is knowing that the most unshakable authority comes not from threats, but from composure. India showed the world that strength is not always measured in how loud you can scream, but in how steady you can remain when provoked. And there is a lesson here for all of us, not just nations. Because in our own lives, how often do we believe that the louder we speak, the stronger we seem? How often do we think that raising our voices will prove we are in control? But true power, real confidence, is the ability to stand firm in silence, to act without noise, to let your choices, not your volume, speak for you. That is what India did. It made a choice, and that choice spoke louder than Trump's tariffs, louder than his speeches, louder than all the chaos he created. When New Delhi suspended those postal services, it was as if the world leaned in closer. Because silence forces you to pay attention. Silence makes you listen harder. And in that silence, the message was crystal clear. We will not engage in your drama. We will not be pulled into your noise. But we will show you that we are unafraid. And isn't that the kind of leadership the world so desperately needs today? Leadership that is not about spectacle, not about intimidation, but about calm confidence. India's quiet power in this moment was not just about defiance. It was about dignity. Because dignity does not scream. Dignity does not need to prove itself. Dignity simply stands unbending, unmoved, unshaken. And when the world sees a nation that responds not with threats, but with dignity, it cannot look away. That dignity becomes undeniable. That dignity becomes unforgettable. And let us not underestimate the ripple effect of this choice. Other nations were watching. They saw that India did not need to mirror America's noise in order to be heard. They saw that quiet action can disrupt the loudest voice. And in that, India set an example for countries everywhere, an example that says you don't have to shout to assert yourself, you don't have to rage to demand respect, you don't have to fight noise with noise. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is step back, take a breath, and act with clarity and calm. Donald Trump may never admit it, but this unsettled him, because for a man who thrives on confrontation, who draws his power from chaos, silence is disarming. He cannot fight silence. He cannot intimidate silence. Silence is a wall his threats cannot break through. And in that silence, Trump was forced to realize that India was not going to play by his rules. It was not going to be dragged into his theater. It was going to chart its own course in its own way with its own quiet but undeniable strength. So let us recognize this moment for what it truly is. It is not about mail services. It is not about tariffs. It is about the redefinition of power. It is about India stepping onto the world stage and saying, we are here, we are strong, and we do not need to shout for you to understand it. That, my friends, is the new face of leadership. That is the new language of dignity. That is the quiet power of India, speaking louder than threats, louder than noise, louder than anything Donald Trump could ever say. And so, as the world reflects on this decision, let us hold on to this truth: the strongest voices are not always the loudest. The most powerful nations are not the ones that scream the hardest. The deepest respect is earned not by noise, but by quiet strength. India has reminded us of this truth, and in doing so, it has shown us a way forward, not just in politics, but in life. Because in a world filled with noise, it is the calm, the steady, the dignified who truly hold the power. When India suspended postal services to the United States, it was easy for some people to dismiss it as just another policy move, another reaction in the messy dance of global trade wars. But if you listen closely, if you look beyond the surface, you would see that this was not just about mail. This was about something far greater. This was about India stepping forward and saying to the entire world, we are no longer small. We are no longer waiting in the shadows. We are here, we are strong, and we will not be dismissed. For decades, India was treated as the junior partner on the world stage. Yes, it had the numbers, over 1 billion people. Yes, it had a proud history, a deep culture, and growing influence. But in the global order dominated by America, by Europe, by China, India was often told to wait its turn. It was often placed on the sidelines, spoken to, but rarely listened to, courted when convenient, but overlooked when critical decisions were being made. That was the story of the old India. The India of patience, the India of quiet endurance, the India that kept rising but was never fully recognized. But when New Delhi took this step, small on the surface but monumental in meaning, it shattered that old story. It told Washington, and it told the entire world, that India is no longer content to sit quietly while others write the script. India is no longer waiting to be invited to the table. India is now building its own table, setting its own terms, and commanding respect not by demand, but by action. That is the global message this moment carried. India is no longer small, and the world must adjust its vision to see it as it truly is. And let me say, this size is not just about numbers. It is about presence. It is about influence. It is about the way your choices ripple across borders and shake the foundations of international politics. When a smaller nation takes an action, it may be brushed aside, politely acknowledged, then ignored. But when India acts, India, with its vast economy, its growing technology sector, its powerful military, its global diaspora, the world has no choice but to pay attention. And that is exactly what happened here. A decision that might have been ignored from another country became global news because it was India making it. That, my friends, is what it means to have arrived. And don't think the world wasn't watching. Nations across Africa, across Asia, across South America, they were watching closely. They saw India stand up to the United States, not with anger, not with war, not with chaos, but with dignity and restraint. And for many of those nations that have long felt the weight of America's dominance, it was a revelation. It was proof that you can resist without collapsing, that you can challenge without begging, that you can say no to the most powerful man in the world and still stand strong. India in that moment became not just a nation, but an example. And this is what makes it so powerful. India's action resonated far beyond the immediate conflict with Trump. It sent ripples into the hearts of leaders everywhere, showing them that the old balance of power is shifting, that the world is no longer a one-man show, no longer a script where America plays the lead and everyone else waits for their cue. The stage is changing, the voices are multiplying, and India's voice is one of the loudest, clearest, and most respected. For too long, India's strength has been underestimated. For too long, people have measured it only in terms of GDP, only in terms of development, only in terms of where it stood compared to others. But what they missed was the resilience of its people, the determination of its leaders, the vast reach of its culture, and the steady rise of its economy. They missed the truth that India, with its combination of tradition and innovation, with its balance of spiritual depth and technological ambition, was becoming not just a regional power, but a global force. This moment, the suspension of postal services, was a declaration of that truth. And let me tell you why this matters so much. Because in international politics, perception is power. It is not just what you are. It is how the world sees you. And for years, the perception of India was that of a nation still on its way, still not quite there, still in the process of becoming. But now the perception is shifting. Now, India is seen as a nation that does not hesitate, does not wait, does not ask permission. It is seen as a nation that acts, and when you act, you command respect. Donald Trump may have believed that his tariffs would remind India of its place, would push it back into the shadows, would weaken its resolve. But instead, he triggered the opposite. He forced India to step forward with clarity, with pride, and with the quiet but undeniable assertion, we are not small anymore, we are global, we are here, and you will hear us whether you want to or not. And in that declaration, something larger was born, a new balance, a new awareness, a new chapter where India is not the background character, but one of the lead actors in the story of the world. That, my friends, is the global message. And once that message is spoken, it cannot be unheard. So let the world take note. Let the leaders of every nation adjust their vision. Because India has risen, India has stepped out of the shadows. India has claimed its space on the global stage, not with arrogance, not with noise, but with dignity. And from this moment forward, India will never again be dismissed as small. The suspension of postal services between India and the United States may look like a small administrative measure on the surface, but when you peel back the layers, you begin to see the deeper meaning. It is a signpost pointing toward a world that is changing right before our eyes. For decades, there has been an established order and unspoken understanding that America sets the rules and the rest of the world follows. But this moment, this quiet and deliberate decision by India is proof that the balance of power is shifting. The old structures are trembling, the ground beneath the world's political stage is cracking, and out of those cracks a new reality is emerging. One where dominance no longer flows in a single direction. It is a reminder that even the mightiest nations must reckon with accountability, and that no leader, no matter how powerful, can stand above consequences. For Donald Trump, who has built his political life on bold threats, on tariffs that cut like knives, on bluster that demands attention, this act from India is more than just inconvenience. It is humiliation, because for once America was not the actor, but the recipient. For once, Washington was forced to pause and realize that decisions have ripple effects, that arrogance cannot always buy compliance, and that in today's world, sovereignty means more than ever. When India chose to suspend postal services, it wasn't just shutting down the movement of letters or parcels. It was making a profound statement. We decide when and how to engage with you. We decide how to measure respect. And if respect is absent, connection too will be absent. This moment, my friends, is not about mail. It is about equality. And what does equality mean in the global context? It means the days when smaller nations could be silenced or overlooked are ending. It means that America, with all its wealth and military power, can no longer dictate without pushback. India's action sends a signal to every corner of the world that the unipolar order is collapsing and a multipolar world is rising in its place. A world where alliances are chosen, not imposed. A world where power is not demanded, but negotiated. A world where dignity, not domination, becomes the currency of diplomacy. This is the dawn of that world. And like every dawn, it comes not with thunder, but with light, slowly, steadily, undeniably. Consider the deeper symbolism. Postal services are not just logistics, they are human connections. They represent people reaching out across oceans, families staying bound across continents, businesses linking hands across borders. To cut off that flow is to remind the world that connections are precious, that they cannot be taken for granted. By suspending something so basic, India has shown that even the smallest act can carry global weight. It teaches us that in a world of grand strategies and military might, sometimes it is the quiet gestures that alter the tide of history. And history will remember this, just as it remembers the nations that once rose against empires, just as it remembers the turning points when the oppressed refused to bow, so too will it remember the moment when India said enough. Because this was not an act of anger, but an act of balance. Not an act of aggression, but of assertion. India did not slam the door on America. It simply refused to let America dictate the terms of the conversation. It created space, forced pause, and demanded reflection. When the story of this era is written, it will not be written in the language of domination. It will be written in the language of change. The United States may still hold power, but it no longer holds monopoly. Nations like India are now stepping forward not as rivals, but as equals. And equality changes everything. It changes trade negotiations, it changes security alliances, it changes the way the world defines leadership itself. No longer will leadership be measured by who shouts the loudest. It will be measured by who commands respect through dignity, by who builds bridges instead of walls, by who recognizes that every nation, no matter how large or small, has a voice worth hearing. That is why this moment matters. Because when India suspended postal services, it told the world, we will not be treated as less. We will not be made invisible. We will not carry the burden of someone else's arrogance. And the world listened. The world saw that action. And the world understood that something fundamental had shifted. The dawn of a new balance is here, and it will not be turned back. So as we look at this chapter, let us not see it as a minor administrative story in the news. Let us see it for what it truly is, a declaration, a turning point, a call to all nations that equality is no longer a dream, but a demand. America may still be powerful, but it will no longer be unchecked. And India, through courage and quiet determination, has proven that respect is not asked for. It is earned, it is expected, and it will be defended. This is the new balance of world politics. And it began remarkably with the suspension of something as simple as the mail.